COVID-19 vaccines are being developed at speed and the results so far are promising, but are they safe and effective?
Hopes are high for the resumption of cross-border travel between Singapore and Malaysia, especially for the thousands who commute every day.
And it's all just a click away how department stores are redefining retail in a COVID-19 world. Good evening. Apologies for the technical glitches in the broadcast earlier. Well, it's the 21st of July, Racial Harmony Day in Singapore. This is The Big Story. I'm Olivia Quay.
And I'm Haryanto Dimana. We're coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. Now subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss a single episode.
We begin with the latest COVID-19 figures. Singapore reported 399 new cases today. Of these, 9 are community cases, 1 Singaporean and 8 work pass holders. There were also 3 imported cases who had been placed on stay-home notices upon arrival here.
The vast majority of the remaining cases are migrant workers living in dormitories. The Health Ministry said today's higher count is mainly due to a batch of test results from the previous day that was reported to the Ministry after yesterday's noon cutoff. The total number of COVID-19 cases here is now over 48,400. More details will be released later.
Early data from 3 potential COVID-19 vaccine trials raised confidence that a vaccine can train the immune system to recognize and fight the virus without serious side effects.
But whether any of these efforts will result in a vaccine capable of protecting billions of people and ending the global pandemic is still far from clear. Much larger studies are required to prove they can safely prevent infection or serious disease.
One of the vaccines being developed by British drug maker AstraZeneca along with Oxford University induced an immune response in all study participants who received 2 doses without any worrisome side effects.
Another vaccine under development by CanSino Biologics and China's Military Research Unit likewise showed that it appears to be safe and induced an immune response in most of the healthy volunteers who got 1 dose.
Studies on both vaccines were published in the Lancet Medical Journal. The announcements of these vaccine trials followed publication last week of results of Moderna's trial showing similarly promising early results.
Joining us now to share more on this is science correspondent Audrey Tan. Audrey, how promising are the trials of the 3 potential vaccines?
So the preliminary results from the trials are promising on 2 key fronts. So the first one would be that there were no dangerous side effects reported by the participants of those trials. And that is not to say there were totally no side effects. Some participants reported effects such as fever or headache, but the researchers said that these could be managed with paracetamol and are not considered dangerous. The second positive sign from the trials was that the vaccines had the capability of inducing a human response in the human body. So what a vaccine tries to do is that it tries to train the human body to recognize the enemy, which is the coronavirus, so the body can mount a response against it. And the trials showed that the vaccines were successful in causing the human body to produce these soldiers, which can help the body fight against an invading pathogen. And that includes immune system elements like antibodies and T cells.
Curious about the phases of making a vaccine, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Are we at phase 1 now? And how long more before we see a working vaccine?
So there are more than 140 vaccine candidates being tested worldwide. Only a number of those are in a phase 1, phase 2 or phase 3 trial. So it really depends which vaccine candidate that you're looking at. And to put things in context, there are many different stages of making a vaccine. And vaccines can take sometimes up to 10 years or more to be produced. There are 5 key stages. There's an exploratory stage, preclinical stage, clinical development, regulatory review before it reaches the manufacturing stage. And when you see references to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, they actually refer to the developments in the clinical development stage. So phase 1, so the studies that were published recently refer to studies done at the phase 1 and phase 2 stages. And this is when like a smaller group of people receive the trial vaccine. There are now ongoing studies for phase 3 for a couple of vaccine candidates, including the one by Oxford University. And this includes giving the vaccine to thousands of people. But even after that, there are still regulatory hurdles to overcome. So I think that it will still be a while yet, like maybe in the next 12 months or more than 12 months before we can see one being officially rolled out. And many key questions remain despite the promising results, and these include questions like will they be effective in preventing an infection? So the results have shown that, okay, it can stimulate the body to produce immune system soldiers, but will that be able to actually stop a person from getting sick? So that's something that researchers want to discover more about in phase 3. And other unknowns include things like how many doses does a vaccine and does a patient need to receive before the body can mount that response. And another key question is how long do antibodies and T cells last? How long is the immunity conferred?
Audrey, let's bring the discussion closer to home. Vaccines are also being developed here in Singapore. How are we doing on that front?
Yeah, so earlier I mentioned that there are more than 140 vaccine candidates being studied worldwide. And in Singapore, we have vaccine candidates in this number as well. So for example, Duke NUS Medical School, they are working with a pharmaceutical company, Arcturus, to develop a mRNA vaccine. But currently, according to the WHO, that is still in the preclinical stage. So we have not yet seen it reach phase 1 yet. But yeah, I mean, given the speed of how things are developing, we may see one soon.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for coming on to explain to us a bit more on the developments of vaccine. Now, we were speaking to science correspondent Audrey Tan.
In other local headlines, 69 more foreign worker dormitories have been cleared of COVID-19 as of today. Sungai Tengah Lodge, the largest purpose-built dorm with around 16,000 workers, is one of 3 such dorms cleared. All workers there can return to work immediately if their employers have the approval to restart operations. In total, 891 dormitories are now cleared of COVID-19, and as of yesterday, about 247,000 workers have either recovered or have been tested free of the virus.
28 people will be charged for flouting safe distancing regulations by holding and attending 2 separate social gatherings. The first group of 18 will be charged for offences during the circuit breaker period, when 16 of them visited the Compassville Crescent home of the other 2 people. The second group of 10 will be charged for offences during phase 2, when they were part of a gathering at Bio Crescent. There were 3 others in that gathering. One is a 14-year-old boy who's received a 12-month conditional warning. The remaining 2 will be dealt with separately.
In a rare move, the People's Action Party Women's Wing has weighed in on a court case, saying it's dismayed at the sentence an NUS student received for trying to strangle his former girlfriend. Dentistry student Yin Ziqin was handed community-based sentences last Friday after pleading guilty to one charge of voluntarily causing hurt, with another charge of criminal trespass taken into consideration. The Home Affairs Ministry will review the penalty framework in similar cases. Among other things, the review will look at the extent to which an offender's background, including educational status, should be a relevant factor in penalties.
Now, you may have noticed that well-known retailers are going online during these challenging times. For instance, Robinsons, Marks & Spencer and Mothercare have been on e-commerce platform Lazada since April.
Robinsons and Marks & Spencer saw more than 300,000 visits to their pages within the first month. Multimedia journalist Kimberly Zhao has more.
In a move to minimize the impact of COVID-19, many brands and businesses are moving online. Amid news of major retail closures around the world, department stores, malls, and other traditional retailers in Singapore are making the switch to go digital. One of them is CapitaLand Malls.
It has always been one of the strategies that we have to be both online and offline. And it wasn't just because of COVID, right, that we decided to just quickly come up with a solution for the months of the circuit breaker. All about 2 years ago, we have launched a platform which is called the Nomads, whereby they have at Plaza Singapura a physical store, but complemented with an online platform. So that was an experiment which we started. But during those 2 years, probably before the COVID situation, the onboarding of tenants was probably not as aggressive and fast. But with what's happening in the recent months, definitely we see a lot more interest, and that's when we also decided to basically use the same kind of engine and then expand it further and launch the eCapital Mall platform.
Many retailers are also collaborating with third-party e-commerce players like Q10 and Shopee. One of the biggest platforms is Lazada. From January to May this year, Lazada onboarded 8 times the number of sellers it did in the same period last year.
COVID acted as a catalyst to have a lot of the brands and the retailers kind of make that jump, I would say, to come online. But this shift has been going on for a while.
The retail industry is always a cyclical business. So whether it was because of COVID, whether when you look at in the 80s, the 90s, the millennial years, retail is always constantly changing. There will always be new trends, new ways of doing things. We are all shoppers, and we are never going to be just 100% online or 100% offline, right? Different products, different kind of channels of reaching out. And it is up to the retailers, it is up to ourselves to adapt, to change, and to fit to the convenience of the consumers.
As the COVID-19 crisis continues to impact the world, it seems that for businesses, having storefronts both online and offline will be the new normal.
Singapore and Malaysia are working to set
Good evening,
up
guys.
a
I'm
green lane and
Dylan Ang.
periodic
Here's the
commuting
headlines
arrangement
from around the world. The Australian state of Victoria is seeing a rise in COVID-19 cases.
Singapore and Malaysia are working to set up a green lane and periodic commuting arrangement for cross-border travel starting on August the 10th. It's welcome news for many people, but operational details of the two schemes are still being discussed.
Before COVID-19 struck, more than 300,000 people used the causeway every day, among which 100,000 Malaysians commuted daily between both countries. One thing is for sure, things will not return to the pre-pandemic situation of commuters freely crossing the border each day.
So our next guest is looking forward to the resumption of cross-border travel. Aarathi Arumugam is president of the Malaysian Association in Singapore. Thank you so much for joining us, Aarathi. Now, the last few months haven't been easy for many Malaysians who live and work in Singapore. What are some of the challenges they've been facing?
Hi there. I think there are a few different challenges. One, the guys who are usually crossing the border on a daily basis, you're looking at difficulties in just getting home. They're used to going home to their families, and now they can't. So they're having to find accommodation here and spending in Singapore dollars, but in Singapore, whereas they're used to obviously taking their Singapore dollar to Malaysia. I think that's the main challenge, because they're having to figure out a new way of surviving, I would say, not even living. So they're having to spend a lot more on accommodation while they're here, food while they're here, transport. Obviously, many of them have bikes, but as you know, petrol and just general tolls and stuff are quite more expensive. So if they're already earning 1,200 to 1,600, and rental is about $480 to $700 a month, that's already more than half their salary gone just in rental, whereas their expenses back in Malaysia are still ongoing. They also haven't been able to see their families. Many of them have young children. Many of them are also the sole breadwinner, taking care of parents who are ill, and they haven't been able to go see their parents. So it's tough. It's been very tough.
And it's a mix of different challenges as well, right? Now, Aarathi, the resumption of cross-border travel is set to be gradual and in phases. For the thousands of Malaysians who commute to and from Singapore, what would you think be the ideal arrangement?
Ideal arrangement obviously would be a green lane, where the people who have to go up and down on a daily basis have some kind of controls put in place, so that I think they were suggesting a controlled itinerary, certain tests that they have to do X number of days instead of every day, just to kind of make sure that we don't have that outbreak of a second wave. That I think would be the ideal situation. Everyone is aware that it is probably a long time coming for something like that to happen, I think, before all countries are comfortable for something like that to happen. But essentially, that would be the ideal situation, especially for the individuals who go up and down on a daily basis. I mean, the additional expense has been quite taxing for them.
Right. Well, your association has provided assistance to Malaysians who have been unable to return home. Can you share with us the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, well, during the MCO, when MCO hit for Malaysia, and then obviously subsequently when circuit breaker hit, we assisted some Malaysians with accommodation expenses. So many of them found themselves in a little bit of a tight spot because they weren't able to afford accommodation, even though they still had jobs in Singapore. They weren't laid off, nor were they put on no pay leave. They were actually diverted to other roles within the company. So thankfully, they were still earning a salary. However, it was insufficient, as I said earlier, to cover costs in Singapore while they were here. So MCO set up a temporary assistance. We don't normally do this, but we set up a temporary assistance to assist with partial accommodation assistance. We also assisted in finding this accommodation because I understand that it was quite difficult for them to secure tenancies and leases because, as you know, in Singapore, it's quite difficult to get short-term leases and short-term tenancy agreements sorted. So we worked with lodges as well as 2-star and 3-star hotels to help us with preferential rates. And with our corporate partners' assistance, we managed to match the two, basically. So we had funding from corporate partners, and we managed to help them cover some of the accommodation costs.
Right. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Aarathi. Thank you so much for your time. We were chatting with President of the Malaysian Association in Singapore, Aarathi Arumugam.
Thank you.
Now, Jan, there haven't been much details on the Singapore-Malaysia Green Lane and commuting arrangement, but could both schemes be scuppered if Malaysia reinforces its movement control order? Now, Malaysia has been in a recovery MCO since June the 10th, but the number of new cases has since been edging up, averaging 14 daily cases since last Friday. 13 new clusters have also been discovered this month.
Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin said yesterday that during this period, every individual, every family, every community is a frontliner to help the country avoid another partial lockdown, which would undo the government's economic recovery efforts.
To expand on this topic is Malaysia Bureau Chief Shannon Teoh, who joins us from Kuala Lumpur. Shannon, we just spoke to the President of the Malaysian Association in Singapore. So if Malaysia does reinforce the MCO, would the two travel schemes, the reciprocal green lane and the periodic commuting arrangement between Malaysia and Singapore, be halted? If so, how detrimental would this be for both countries?
Well, it's not a sure thing because the movement control order is gazetted, and whatever the government gazettes, those are the regulations, those are the orders. Of course, when we first went into the MCO in March, the borders were completely shut, right? We could go back to that, but there is no guarantee that that will be one of the restrictions that the government will impose back then. But I think if numbers do rise, then there will be both public pressure, and I think from the healthcare authorities, they will be saying that, well, closing borders is one of the ways to keep things in control. So it would be on the cards. How detrimental it would be, I think, as per the interview earlier, there's a lot of costs involved, right? I mean, for the people who are affected. And there's also the industry, the economy, the workers that need to cross, the business travelers. We are still looking forward to when not just normal tourists for leisure can cross, and that's a long way from happening. So there is a lot of economic impact if we had to roll back into an MCO.
Shannon, yesterday Mr. Muhyiddin expressed concern about the relaxed attitude of some Malaysians since the start of the recovery MCO on June 10th. Now, could you elaborate on the current public attitude, and was Mr. Muhyiddin's address yesterday a wake-up call?
Well, it kind of marked the midway point of the RMCO, the recovery MCO. But it just so happened that over the weekend, cases had continued to rise from what was usually single digit, but then we suddenly had several days of double digits, and the average, including Monday's 21, that was yesterday, that's been about averaging 15, 16 cases a day for the past 4 days. So there is a sense now in Malaysia, just a bit of alarm. I wouldn't say panic, but people are starting to notice that, hey, the numbers are creeping up quite consistently. If you're talking about public attitude, well, I think there is a lot of debate now. When do you wear a mask? When do you not wear a mask? Are enough people wearing masks? Should you be wearing masks in your taxis, in your Grabs? Should you be wearing masks in an elevator? You know, it's all not mandatory. It's all on advice. So the mask thing has become one of the central debates, but there's obviously more than that. It's about social distancing. It's about hygiene for your hands. It's hard to kind of say what is the level of compliance, but you do see hand sanitizers at the front of every premise. Whether people use them is another question.
Okay, well, the World Bank expects Malaysia's GDP to shrink by 3.1% this year. Now, over the weekend, the government launched a Buy Malaysian Products campaign. But how big of an impact will the consumer dollar make in Malaysia's recovery efforts?
So, private consumption makes up something like 60% of Malaysia's economy, or of the GDP. And when that falls, that brings a lot of the economy down with it. The figures for April in terms of retail and manufacturing sales were down by a third year on year. So that's the kind of impact that the MCO has had. What Muhyiddin has tried to do is not dissimilar to what previous prime ministers have tried to do when they try to spur the economy, you know, a buy local kind of campaign. But right now it's really needed. I mean, there's a lot of industry, a lot of businesses out there not getting enough sales. They might have to close down. That will affect the number of jobs. And so it's all cyclical, right? Given April's numbers, we don't have May's numbers, but May was full MCO as well. So we would expect that it's been 2 consecutive months of very low sales. So this is something where I think he's trying to encourage, obviously, domestic consumption, but it has to come hand in hand with other things, right? You have to encourage people with more than just words. Are there going to be certain kind of tax breaks, some kind of incentive? So we'll need to watch out for that, how the government really wants to, how far do they want to push this level?
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Shannon. Always a pleasure to speak with you. We've been speaking to the Straits Times Malaysia Bureau Chief, Shannon Teoh. Now, you can go to thestraitstimes.com to keep updated with the latest developments across the causeway.
Well, speaking of latest developments, Malaysia and Singapore will ink agreements to finalise the much-delayed Johor Bahru Singapore Rapid Transit System Link project on July 30th. The signing ceremony will be held at the causeway and witnessed by the Prime Ministers of both countries.
Construction work for the RTS is slated to commence in January next year, and the rail link is expected to begin operations in late 2026. The project is estimated to cost around 3.7 billion Malaysian ringgit or 1.2 billion Singapore dollars. Now let's take a look at more global headlines.
Good evening, guys. I'm Dylan Ang. Here's the headlines from around the world. The Australian state of Victoria is seeing a rise in COVID-19 cases, reporting 374 new infections compared with 275 cases a day earlier. It has also seen 3 deaths. Victoria alone accounts for nearly half of the total infections in Australia. Spain's coronavirus rate has risen 3-fold over the last 3 weeks, as authorities struggle to contain a rash of fresh clusters. Infection rates had dropped after an early April peak, but have been steadily rising since restrictions were lifted. Russia hopes to complete trials of a coronavirus vaccine in August and produce 200 million doses with foreign partners by the end of the year. Over in Japan, Japanese drug maker Shionogi also said it aims to boost production capacity to produce enough vaccines for 30 million people annually by the end of 2021. In non-coronavirus news, US President Donald Trump said he would send federal law enforcement to more US cities as a crackdown on anti-racism protests in Oregon angered people across the country for its use of unmarked cars and unidentified forces. He cited New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Baltimore and Oakland, California as places to send federal agents, noting the city's mayors were Liberal Democrats. In football, the prestigious Ballon d'Or award will not be awarded this year for the first time in its 64-year history, despite the restart of major European leagues. Organisers France Football magazine said the COVID-19 pandemic had wreaked havoc on the football calendar. It is unclear when the award will return. And those were the global updates. It's back to you guys in the studio.
Thanks, Dylan. Now, we're seeing comments on our comment section asking why we are dressed in traditional garb today. Well, this is to mark, of course, Racial Harmony Day that happens every year in Singapore on the 21st of July. So on that note, I have to ask you, Olivia, what is the one thing that you look forward to back in school, for Racial Harmony Day?
Yeah, it was definitely better celebrated and better commemorated in school. So what I remember from those days, decades ago, of course, the opportunity to dress up in something other than your uniform, and of course, the fact that you get to wear the traditional cultural costumes, and you don't even have to wear your own. You can wear another culture's costumes, and it was always great fun. And I remember in secondary 4, when my entire class, all over 40 of us, dressing up. So, and the fact that it was secondary 4, it's your last year in secondary school. You're spending it with people you may never see again. So it was just a really nice,
good memories.
Yes, a really nice way of class unity. Yes, I really treasure those times indeed.
Yeah, I think it's the same for me as well.
Yep. Well, we want to hear your best memories of Racial Harmony Day as well. So please leave your comments below, and you can also visit straitstimes.com for more news and videos, and subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red button below.
Once again, I'm Haryanto Diman with Olivia Quay, of course. Join us tomorrow for more stories on The Big Story.